Muy buenos días. Muchas gracias por su asistencia hoy aquí. Estamos celebrando un evento académico más que me parece que es muy interesante. Abona a varias de los cuerpos académicos y líneas de investigación que tenemos en nuestra unidad. Es un elemento, como yo diría, infraestructural en términos cognitivos, mentales, lo que aborda el doctor Iakovos Vasiliou, que tiene que ver con la percepción y el pensamiento, ¿no? La analogía entre percepción y pensamiento, que son conceptos que subyacen a muchos de los análisis que hacemos en nuestros cuerpos y líneas de investigación. La cognición humana es uno de los elementos fundamentales en la investigación en nuestra unidad, y bueno, esto es algo que agrega reflexión, debate, discusión, toma de puntos de vista, etc. Entonces, bueno, yo lo que quiero hacer es solamente decir que desde la perspectiva de la unidad Guajimalpa, a la cual represento, pues es un gusto y un honor tener este tipo de eventos de alta calidad como la conferencia que tendremos hoy. El contexto es el seminario sobre percepción que conduce el doctor Álvaro Peláez y que tiene ya alrededor de un año de existir y de pues, generar, ¿no?, este tipo de reflexiones que son las que necesitamos en la universidad. Entonces, bueno, sin más, yo lo que quiero decir solamente es que pues, doy la bienvenida a todos ustedes a este evento, y en nombre de la unidad pues, me congratulo de que empecemos el día de hoy con este evento y que continuemos con esta serie de actividades. Entonces los dejo con el doctor Álvaro Peláez y con el doctor Iakovos Vasiliou, quien hará una conferencia acerca de Aristóteles sobre la analogía entre percepción y pensamiento. Muchas gracias.
Brevemente, bueno, estamos muy contentos en el seminario, el proyecto sobre percepción que conduzco, y en general en la unidad, en nuestra división, de tener al profesor Iakovos Vasiliou como invitado al mismo. También estamos muy contentos por la asistencia de todos ustedes y la presencia notable de nuestro rector, que ha apoyado decididamente la realización del evento. Le agradecemos nuevamente su amabilidad desde el principio por apoyar en cuanto me planteé la posibilidad de este evento y por su asistencia hoy y la presentación que acabo de realizar. Voy a hacer brevemente una lectura de unas breves semblanzas del profesor Iakovos. Es profesor de filosofía en el Centro de Posgrado de la Universidad de Nueva York, doctor en filosofía por la Universidad de Pittsburgh. Su línea de investigación gira en torno a la filosofía antigua, la ética, la epistemología y la filosofía política, especialmente en Platón y Aristóteles. El doctor Vasiliou ha enseñado en la Universidad Cornell, la Universidad Johns Hopkins y la Universidad del Estado de Georgia. Es autor del libro Aiming at Virtue in Plato, publicado en 2008, y numerosos artículos en revistas especializadas. Bueno, nuevamente le damos la bienvenida y el agradecimiento especial por acompañarnos hoy. Lo dejamos.
I'm very honored to be here. I want to thank UAM, and I don't have a lot of microphone experience, and everyone for inviting me to come here, especially Álvaro Peláez, and also my student Adriana Renero, who has been such a wonderful host. It's exciting to me to be here. I would like to say too that I apologize, I regret the fact that I can't deliver this lecture in Spanish. I wish I could, and I appreciate the extra trouble that you're all going to go through in order to listen to what I say and try to understand it, and the translators who are translating it for me, I'm very grateful to them. I have two aims in this talk. The first, and probably the primary aim of the talk, is to provide some basic overview of Aristotle's account of perception and thought, and the analogy he draws between them. If I have time, I will also get to some views that I have about the strangeness of Aristotle's account of theoretical thought, which I'm just going to refer to with the Greek word nous. Nous is a very specialized word for Aristotle, as I'll talk about in a minute. It doesn't mean just ordinary thinking, but it means a very specialized scientific kind of thinking where one grasps what the essence of things are. So it's something that's the result of a lot of study and training. Okay. For better or worse, to present this material to you requires a significant amount of background, of Aristotelian background. So there's quite a bit of apparatus that goes into understanding Aristotle's position. And so for quite a while I'm going to set that up, and then hopefully that'll put us in a position to appreciate his views on perception and the analogy with thought and nous in particular. The primary text that I'm going to be focusing on today is Aristotle's De Anima, his work called On the Soul. This is part of his natural philosophy in general, part of his physics, his study of nature. It focuses on the study of living things. So the De Anima is the part of Aristotle's natural philosophy that turns to things that have a soul. To have a soul is to be animate, is to be alive for Aristotle. He distinguishes types of life by different sorts of activities that organisms and people, and indeed also God, engage in. So one key Aristotelian thought is that living is an activity, something you do. The most basic kind of activity is nutrition. Nutrition, growth, reproduction, and so on. So in this respect, we, animals and plants, we all have this capacity of soul, this function, what he calls the nutritive function, the function that enables us to grow and breathe and do sort of automatic things like that. The next major group is perception, the activity of perception. This is what distinguishes, according to Aristotle, plants from animals. And of course, human beings also engage in perception. Aristotle devotes a very large part of the De Anima to the study of perception. Almost a third of the entire work, or a little more than a third of the work, is on perception, both perception in general, and that he treats each of the five senses in detail. I'm just going to talk today about perception in general and not go into those particular accounts, but it's good that you know that. Then after this, we have human beings. The difference between human beings and animals, unsurprisingly, is that human beings are capable of thought and reasoning. Now, this is where I just want to make one division here in terms of thought. There's ordinary thought and reasoning, which includes things like deciding whether you're going to go to college or not, deciding what to buy at the grocery store, deciding what you think would be the right or moral thing to do. There's that kind of deliberation. And there's also things like imagining what it would make a fun vacation or something like that. Let's call that ordinary thinking. And then there's what I've already alluded to, theoretical nous, which is this specialized grasp that I'm going to be focusing on at the end. All human beings have the capacity to reason, have that ordinary thinking. As we'll see by the time I get to the end of the talk, very few human beings have theoretical nous. And that's going to sound like a funny thing to say, but that's what I'm going to try to persuade you of by the time I'm done. Okay, key to Aristotle's overall approach to the soul and to the relationship between soul and body is his hylomorphism. So this is the first item on the handout, 1A there, hylomorphism. Hylomorphism is even an English made-up word in some sense. It just means form in matter, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Aristotle thinks that substances in general, all concrete things, tables, the house, animals and plants, are combinations of what he calls form and matter. So we need to understand some basic elements of this hylomorphism if we're going to understand the claims in the Deonum that we're turning to. So I'm going to start with some basic points that come from actually Aristotle's physics. And as I pointed out to you already, physics means on nature, so on his natural philosophy. Central to his physics is a question about change. Now, change is pervasive in the natural world. He says the natural world is a world of change. That's obvious to us. And change is going to be very important for the topics that we're focusing on, namely perception and thought, because he's going to think of perception and thought as changes that animals, for the case of perception, and animals and human beings undergo when they perceive or think about something. So we're going to try to look at the basic structure of change from the physics, and then we'll see that Aristotle takes that conceptual apparatus and applies it in the Deonum. Okay, so for Aristotle, every substance, every concrete thing, as I said, is a combination of matter and form. So to illustrate this, we're just going to use a simple example. I'll use the example of a house. And Aristotle himself uses the example of artifacts. He's going to start the analogy with artifacts, and then he's going to move over to living organisms. So for a house, the matter of this building, let's say, to put it simply, is bricks and mortar, bricks and cement. That's the matter, the stuff, the physical stuff. But Aristotle's point is, you don't have a house if all you have is bricks and mortar. You need something else. The bricks and mortar have to be in a certain arrangement. They have to be shaped a certain way. Okay. Only when you add the form, and as our first step towards understanding what form is, we can think of it as shape, the shape of the house. The form of this building is represented in the plans of the architect. Okay? And then obviously some builders have come along and taken the bricks and mortar and put it into the shape dictated by the plans, the architect's plans, the form. Okay. Now you're in a position to appreciate a couple of conceptual connections with these ideas. Aristotle connects the concept of matter to the concept of potentiality. Why would you say that? Well, the bricks and mortar are potentially the house. They're not actually a house yet, right? They become actually a house when the form is imposed on the matter. Pretty simple, right? The builders come along, take the bricks and mortar, put it into the shape of the architect's plans, and then it went from a potential house to an actual house. So form gets associated with the concept of actuality, and matter is associated with the concept of potentiality. You're also in a position now to appreciate what Aristotle calls his four causes. Aristotle's four causes, and the word cause in Greek, aitia, where in English you have the word, a word like etiology, the causal history. It's important to understand aitia is a broader notion than our notion of cause. It includes, for example, an explanation. An aitia is really an answer to a why question. So Aristotle, in his theoretical works, is seeking understanding of his subject matter. And so if you want to understand a thing, you want to know all about it. You want to know why it is the way it is. And Aristotle gives an account of what it would be to fully explain how a thing is, and that account is called his four causes. And this is 1b on your handout, item B. So we'll stay with the example of a house. The material cause, it's going to be no surprise to you, refers to the matter. That would be so if you ask, what is the material cause of the house? It would be the bricks and mortar. Now, of course, that's the sense in which cause is a funny word. The bricks and mortar don't cause the house to come into being, right? That doesn't make any sense. But bricks and mortar is part of the full explanation of this structure and why it is the way it is. Part of the reason it has some properties it does is because it's made of bricks and mortar. If it was made of, ice, it would have a different set of properties. Second cause on the handout, B2, is the formal cause. The formal cause, unsurprisingly, cites the form, refers to the form. So when you give the formal cause of the house, you're going to describe the design of this house. The third is the efficient cause. with an E. To effect with an E is to bring about something. The efficient cause is the one that sounds most to us like an ordinary cause. If I just walked up to you and said, what caused this building? You'd look at me a little strangely, and then you'd say something like, well, I don't know, some people built it. At some point, somebody came, workers came and put the house together. That's what caused it. So that's the efficient cause, the builder building. The last cause is important for Aristotle, and will be important to have in the background when we turn to perception and thought, is called the final cause. The final cause of something states the end, or the goal. In Greek, the telos. It's where you get the word teleology. Aristotle thinks that, we'll start with artifacts. Artifacts clearly have an end, a goal. This house was built with a purpose. So, most simplistically, to provide shelter. But when you go to a university building and you see its design, right, the explanation of why it was designed the way it was is because it's designed that way to serve a purpose. So if this is a classroom building, that's why it's not designed the same way as a house where people live, and so on. Again, not very complicated. Aristotle will turn out to think, too, that not only do artifacts have ends or purposes, the pen is for writing, the house is for shelter, but also living organisms do. Aristotle believes in natural teleology. So he thinks that a rabbit, for example, has a goal. You might wonder, what's the goal of a rabbit? Well, the goal of a rabbit is to live a rabbit life. A full rabbit life. What is that? You know, running away from foxes, eating carrots, jumping around, you know, having little baby rabbits, doing all the things that rabbits do, right? That's a rabbit life. And that's the goal of a rabbit. And it's part of an explanation, the sense of idea where it's explaining. If you want to understand why a rabbit is the way it is, why does it look the way it does, why does it have big ears and this, it's partially because it's in order for it to live its rabbit life. If it didn't have that, it wouldn't be able to live a rabbit life. And the same goes for an oak tree, and the same is going to go for a human being. You can see now, this is stepping back a little bit broader picture from the talk, if you think about what the end of a human being is, what the goal of a human being is, that's a question about ethics. Right? It's obviously to lead an excellent human life. Now, what is an excellent human life consistent? Well, Aristotle talks about that in a work called the Nicomachean Ethics, and that's where that is. But we're focused on the natural philosophy today. So now what I want to do is take this apparatus that I've just discussed from the physics and apply it to the account in the De Anima. And this is where things get a little more complicated. The house example was fairly simple. This is a little more involved. When Aristotle turns in the De Anima to discuss living things, he brings in his hylomorphism again. He wants to use form and matter. But the analogy between artifacts and living things doesn't work as smoothly as he might like at first, or as he wants it to work. How come? Well, think about the house. You've got the matter, the bricks and the mortar, and then you've got the form. And a builder comes along and imposes the form on the matter. Now with a living thing, if you just wanted to apply form-matter distinction to a living thing, you'd say, well, the matter is presumably the body, right? The bunny's body, your body, arms, legs, that's the matter. And the form is going to be what makes the matter alive. And the word for that for Aristotle is the soul. Okay, the soul is what animates the body, right? De Anima is on the soul, it's on living things. Remember too, for the Greeks, it's not controversial that there are souls. To believe in a soul, from the Greek perspective, is not to believe in something that's religious or something that necessarily exists separately from the body. The Greeks argued about whether there was anything like that, and I may mention it briefly near the end of the talk. But all it takes to believe in a soul, from the Greek perspective, is to believe that there are living things. So if you denied there are souls, you would deny that there are things that are alive. Things that are animate, right? The Latin word for soul. Okay, so if we apply the matter-form distinction to living organisms straightforwardly, you'd have the body, and then the soul would be the form, and something would put the form into the body. Now, if that was the picture, it would be a very dualist account. A dualist account being there be one kind of substance, the body, and a different kind of substance, the soul, and something puts them together, and then it becomes a living thing. Aristotle was a very empirically minded philosopher. He did a lot of work on biology. He studied all sorts of plants and animals. Matter of fact, more than a third of all of his corpus, his extant corpus, consists of biological works. And it's obvious that things don't become alive. You don't get an actual living bunny rabbit by taking some bunny stuff and suddenly going, and it kind of starts jumping around. That's not how living things come to be. They come to be from seeds. They come to be from other bunnies. People come to be from people, and so on, right, in any normal reproduction way. What that means is that it's never the case that anything that is potentially alive isn't already actually alive. This is a little tricky. This leads to his three stages, potentiality and actuality. I'll come back to this right now. 1C on the handout. In the De Anima, he complicates the picture of potentiality and actuality. There are only two things involved. Now it's a three-stage process. One thing that's potentially confusing is that the second stage has two different names. Let's go through it with an example that'll make it simple. The first stage, we'll call it potentiality, or sometimes it's called first potentiality, you'll see why, would be something like the potentiality everyone here has to learn Greek. So you all have the potentiality to learn Greek. That makes you different, of course, from a dog or from the chair, right? The dog and the chair don't have the potentiality to learn Greek, so not everything has it. Only human beings have the potentiality to learn Greek. Stage 2 is if you went and studied and you actually know Greek. So with respect to Greek, I'm at stage 2. I actually know Greek. Okay. But for Aristotle, part of his natural philosophy is the idea of things realizing their nature, of them being all they can be. So in the bunny example before, the rabbit example, a rabbit fulfilling its end is leading an active rabbit life, running around and doing all the things that rabbits do. That's different from, would be stage 3 on the handout, the second actuality. So, go back to the Greek example. Right now I actually know Greek, but we could say I'm not being all I can be insofar as I know Greek. I could be a little better with respect to my knowledge of Greek. Well, how could I be better or more realized? Well, I could start speaking Greek. So when I start speaking Greek or reading Greek, then I'm being all I can be. I'm in a full state of actuality with respect to my knowledge of Greek. Okay, so we've got the three stages: potentially knowing Greek, actually knowing Greek, and then exercising that knowledge, using that knowledge. Okay, this could be, now with a bunny rabbit, with a living organism, right? The bunny rabbit is never at stage 1. This is the point. Anything that is, as I said before, potentially alive must already be actually alive. The rabbit fetus is actually alive. The form and matter are together with it already. Okay? And then in its normal development, it gets, when it's born, the rabbit's born, or the egg hatches, or the seed grows, the oak tree, the acorn in the oak tree, that acorn already has the form and matter together. So you never get them apart the way you do with the house. You get the bricks and mortar apart from being a constructed house. That separation doesn't exist. The result is there's no stage 1 potentiality for a living organism. Okay. Everything is always stage 2. You're at stage 2 at night when you're asleep. You're actually a human being, but you're not living an actual fulfilling human life at that moment. You're just resting. Okay? Of course, when you wake up, you'll start to do that. Right now, we're all at stage 3. Very good stage 3, in fact. We're engaging in philosophy. Right? The most important thing to do as human beings, we're all actively gauging, thinking about these ideas. Okay. Good. Now, we're almost to perception. How am I doing with time? Let me just connect the soul body to Aristotle's four causes, since we went through them. Aristotle thinks the soul is the cause of the living body in 3 of the 4 ways. The body is obviously the material cause, so the body is the matter of the living organism, even though you never find that matter separated from the form. It's still obviously the matter. The soul is the form, right? The soul is dictated by the capacities of the body to do different things. So the human soul is such that we have the capacities not only for nutrition, but also for perception, also for thought. The bunny rabbit has nutrition and perception, but not thought, and so on. It's the efficient cause, meaning the soul, the form, is what is responsible for us growing and developing in the direction that we are growing and developing in. Right? It's not an accident that you go from an infant human being to an adult human being. You don't go from an infant human being to an oak tree. And part of that is dictated by the fact of the form. The form and the matter as being different. And lastly, the soul dictates the final cause of the organism. Right? The bunny rabbit soul is what makes a bunny rabbit life the final cause of it. Our soul is what makes a life with the exercise of reason part of our end and final goal. Okay, now we're ready to turn to perception. So how does perception work with Aristotle? And we'll be leaning on the apparatus that I've just spent a while laying out. We don't get the ability to perceive by practicing. We're born with the ability to perceive. Insofar as you have the ability to hear, and you weren't born deaf, right? You just started hearing. Now, I don't know enough about, matter of fact, I know very little about biology or anatomy. So infant babies, do they see immediately? Do they not? Or they only see black and white? Or do they hear immediately? That doesn't matter. It may not happen immediately, but in the course of the normal natural development of the organism, the baby organism, whatever type it is, begins to perceive. Right? You woke up one day and you were seeing or you were hearing. That means that our capacity for perception is always at stage 2. Right? We are actually able to perceive. It's not like there was something potentially perceiving, but actually perceiving. Now, actually, in the sense of first actuality, if you close your eyes right now, you are actually have the capacity for vision. You're not potentially able to see, you're actually able to see. But of course, you're not being all you can be as someone exercising vision until you open your eyes. When you're opening your eyes, you're exercising your vision. So that transition from stage 2 to stage 3, from having the, as Aristotle puts it, second potentiality to see. For example, when you're asleep at night, you have the potential to see. You just need to wake up and open your eyes, and then you'll begin seeing. And then you go to third actuality. Third item about perception. For perception to occur, and this is fairly obvious, there needs to be some external object. If you're sitting in a room and there's absolutely no sound and it's completely quiet, you can't by yourself hear something. I mean, you could clap your hands and make noise to hear something, but there needs to be an external noise that activates your hearing and moves it from stage 2 to stage 3. So sitting in the silent room, you're at stage 2, you're able to hear, but you're not actually hearing. He describes this transition, Aristotle describes the transition from stage 2 to stage 3 as a kind of alteration, as a kind of change in the sense faculty, in the sense organ. He describes the transition from stage 2 to stage 3 as receiving the form without the matter. That's the slogan. When you see, you receive the form of the object without receiving the matter. So what does that mean? There's a lot of argument about what it means. At first, you could say, if you're seeing something red, like the red chair, my eye doesn't take in the matter of the chair. The matter of the chair, fortunately, stays over there where it is. Right? What it takes in is the sensible form, which is the redness of the chair. Now, scholars argue about what Aristotle thinks happens in the sense organ when it moves from potentially able to see to actually seeing. On some accounts, these are called literalists, they think that Aristotle's view is that my eye literally becomes, my eyeball literally becomes the color that I'm perceiving. So when I perceive red, my eye jelly literally turns red. An advantage of this is it's kind of simple, straightforward. A disadvantage of it is it's wacky and very strange and wildly implausible, right, as an account, and so that's negative. And it yields funny counterintuitive results, so that if you're smelling something, if you're smelling a strong cheese, then your nose smells like strong cheese itself. It has all these funny results like that. And but there are some things that Aristotle says that suggest that maybe that's what's going on. Other people think, they're called spiritualists, that Aristotle has a very strange view where there's no material change in the sense organ at all. That perceiving is just, by our lights, kind of magical. It's a quasi-change. It's not a real genuine change. It's not like painting a house red, right? The house goes from not red to red. You paint it. On the literal conception, my eye jelly goes from not being red to actually being red when I'm seeing something red. On this view, it's a quasi-change. One way of explaining what that's like is if my eye jelly is transparent, like this water, right? And then you want to see black, like this. So there's no change to the color of the water. It's just something black goes behind the transparent water, and the magic of the eyeball is that the transparency of the eyeball is just able to perceive. Of course, the water doesn't perceive the black, but my eye magically does this. That's why it's called spiritualist, and there's some good evidence for this. There's kind of a middle position to which I'm most sympathetic, which is something happens materially to the eye when you perceive something, but it doesn't literally become red. Something analogous happens. There's some sort of ratio in the colors, and the ratios in the eyes change so that you end up perceiving red. There's some kind of connection there between form and the concept of logos, or ratio, or reason. Okay, but we don't need to worry about too much more about that. I just wanted to lay out those positions. So it's in the transition from stage 2 to stage 3, however it actually works, that awareness happens. Last point I want to make about perception. What's important and will be important as we move now in the final part of the lecture to the case of thought, what is the highest activity of your sense, namely actually seeing or actually hearing, it has the same relationship to the object. So Aristotle thinks of objects too that way. So this book is potentially yellow if I take some paint and I paint it yellow, right? So in that sense, it's got the potentiality to become yellow. It's actually black. Okay. Now, when it's actually black, if we all leave the room, this book is going to remain black, even if no one's looking at it. But the blackness of this book is stage 2, right? Actually black. But the blackness, and this is a little odd sounding though it is not being all it can be as blackness until it's being perceived as blackness by a perceiver. Now the interesting thing is that when this blackness is all it can be by being perceived, and when my eyes are being all they can be by perceiving the blackness, that activity, that stage 3 activity, second actuality, is one and the same activity. The activity of the blackness being perceived is the same activity as me perceiving it. They're united. It's one act. As Aristotle says, describable in 2 ways. The analogy is teaching and learning, right? You're potentially able to learn something, stage 2, right? If someone's a knower, like a knower of Greek, is potentially able to teach Greek, he's stage 2, right? If you're actually teaching, someone has to be actually learning, and that's one and the same activity, right? So, contrary to what most professors would like to think, if you're up here talking and talking but no one's getting it, then you're not actually teaching. You're saying a lot of things, you're pretending to, but teaching is not happening unless actual learning is happening, right? And that's one and the same activity. Okay, the reason I dwell on this is because it's going to be important now as we turn to thought and look for the analogy there. Okay, this was, I think I forgot to mention, Section 2, Passage 2 on the handout. Maybe I'll just read a little bit of that to you because it's difficult. Section 2, Passage 2, this is where he says the point that I just made. It's good to read a little Aristotle together. The activity of the object of perception and of the sense is one and the same, although what it is for them to be such is not the same. I won't read the rest of it. The what is it for them to be such is the point that teaching and learning are described in two different ways, even though they're one and the same activity. Okay, hope we're so far so good. Now we'll turn to thought. The aspect of thought that I'm going to focus on now in the last part, and the aspect of thought that Aristotle draws the strongest analogy and an interesting analogy with, is, as I told you before, theoretical nous. And this happens in Book 3, Chapter 4. Aristotle draws a bunch of analogies between perception and thought, and also some disanalogies. And I want to explore those now in the last part of the talk, and then to suggest that Aristotle's view of nous and most people's understanding of Aristotle's view of nous is wrong. And I'll float for you a different one. I'll present you with a different one, which will be a little, I'll just warn you, strange. The main analogy between thinking and perception is that Aristotle describes thought, as he describes perception, as taking on the form without the matter. So when you think too, you take on what he calls an intelligible form. Okay? So if you're thinking of the Pythagorean theorem, as you look at a triangle in the corner of the wall over there, you say, oh, the old Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Then your mind takes on that intelligible form without the matter. When I caused before in all of you, when you started to think about rabbits, you thought about what it is to be a rabbit, the nature of a rabbit, what they're like, and of course your mind didn't take on rabbit matter, it took on the essence of a rabbit. That's going to be qualified in a minute. But one enormous difference right off the bat, and this is a surprising thing, between perception and thought, is that for Aristotle, thought, nous, has no bodily organ. He doesn't associate thinking with the brain. Right? We assume thinking, my stomach digests and my brain does the thinking. Okay, my teeth do the chewing. Right? So each of the parts are for something, but Aristotle very surprisingly says, but nous, thought, has no bodily organ. Why does he say this? It's a strange thing. Well, the reason he says this is because, and it's an interesting reason, and a reason that's not as silly as it first appears. With the senses, the fact that they're material, your eyeballs are material, the materiality of your eyeball constrains what can count as a possible object of perception. Your eyeball, designed the way it is set to receive light waves. It's not able to receive sound waves. You can't hear with your eyes, right? And you can't smell with your eyes. And the reason you can't smell with your eyes is in part because of how your eye is constructed. It's constructed to take vision, to take objects of sight, obviously, and not air. It doesn't take air in the same way as your nose does or something like that. So Aristotle thought that if your mind was made of a physical organ, the very physicalness of it would constrain what it could possibly think. And the interesting thing about thought, he says, is you can think about anything. Right? You can't see smells, right? And you can't hear sights, but you can think about smells, you can think about sights, you can think about people, you can think about the Pythagorean theorem. The mind is able to think about all these objects. For it to be potentially anything, it must be actually nothing. So, here's another thing. Remember, with sense perception, the organs of sense perception are at stage 2. But thinking, nous, human beings are at stage 1 with regard to nous. Right? You're not born with understanding yet. Right? You have to acquire it. It's like you guys don't know Greek yet, or some of you don't know Greek. Those of you who don't know Greek, right, are at stage 1 there. What's also interesting about Aristotle is at stage 1, there is no nous yet. Right? So think of stage 2 with perception. Your eyes are sitting there at night when you're asleep. They're actually there. And then you open your eyes and they start seeing. With nous, right now, when you don't understand something, like if you don't have nous of Greek, there's nothing there. We tend to think your mind is there. But Aristotle says your nous isn't there. Surely the human being has the potentiality to acquire something, but that acquisition, there's no faculty there sitting there at stage 1 that's getting ready, on analogous with the way your eyeballs and your ears are ready and able to see or to hear. So he says this. Take a look, for example, at 3:2 for some text here. He says, nous is in actuality none of the things that are, none of the things that exist, before it intellects. Intellect is a funny translation. I did that on purpose just to show you that that word nous is being used, nous noein, before it understands. It's nothing at all. Now what does this mean? And here's the last part of the talk now, where I'll draw a couple surprising conclusions from this. Stage 1, theoretical nous, is nothing but the human being's soul's capacity for acquiring knowledge. If nous is really nothing until it thinks, until it gets some understanding, it's never going to understand, for Aristotle, until a person has grasped an essence. This is what I meant by theoretical nous is not ordinary thinking. For Aristotle, when you've grasped an essence, that's when you know a thing. It's very hard to grasp an essence. If I were to ask you, what is a bunny rabbit? The answer is something like the bunny rabbit's DNA. It's not easy to find. You have to study and think. It's a long way to acquire what Aristotle calls this first principle. And the first principle is the knowledge of an essence. You might know the essence of a triangle, that it's three-sided. That's hard. You have to study some geometry to learn that, to understand what the essence of something is. So if Aristotle says that at stage 1, nous is nothing until it thinks, that means the majority of people who don't grasp the scientific essences of things don't have any nous. Now, if you think, as a lot of commentators also think, if you think of nous as a faculty, if you think of nous as the mind or the faculty of thought instead of the understanding that comes at the end of the thought, it can sound very strange, right? If nous is simply theoretical understanding of essences, then it's trivial to say people that don't understand essences don't understand essences. But if intellect suggests mind, then you're saying people that don't understand essences don't have a mind. And that sounds very strange. So let's pause there and look at the second difference now between nous and sense perception, and then I'll come back to it. I'm almost, have just a few more minutes left. The second difference between nous and sense perception is, remember with sense perception when I described the identity of perception and the object happening at stage 3, right? When the blackness being all it can be and me seeing the blackness, that's one and the same activity. What's striking in passage 3, under heading number 3 on page 2, is that nous becomes identical to its object at stage 2, not at stage 3. It's also identical at stage 3, but that identity comes earlier at stage 2. Potential nous is nothing, and then actual nous at stage 2 is already identical to its object. So look at passage 3, and after this long and difficult lecture, you're now in a position to understand this passage on your own, right? So we can read it together. When nous has become each thing, in the way that one who actually knows is said to do so. What way is that? That's first actuality, stage 2, the actual knower of Greek. And this happens when he can exercise his capacity by himself. I have a capacity you don't. I can start. I can just start speaking Greek. If you don't know Greek, you can't start doing that. You can learn it, but I can activate that capacity when I want. Now, for nous, that activation, that identity happens at stage 2, not at stage 3. So what does this mean? What's the significance of this? Well, at stage 2, understanding that the identification of nous and the object already happens at stage 2 supports my suggestion before that we shouldn't think of nous as a faculty. It's not a faculty that has intelligible forms, the way your faculty of sight has sensible forms. Rather, nous is the intelligible forms. That identity is already there at stage 2. So what nous is the understanding. It's a very strange idea. It's not your mind that has the understanding. You as a human being just have the understanding. And once you have the understanding, you can activate it. You can contemplate it. On analogy with how you start to, one can start to speak Greek. Take this point now from Chris Shields. This is a scholarly article, a little more difficult now the last couple of minutes. Follow this argument by him because I have a view that is close to his but importantly different. He says, if strong isomorphism were true, strong isomorphism is just the idea that the mind and the object share the same form. The form is the same in both. Then on the assumption that two people can think the same object, your intellect could be numerically identical with mine in contemplation. Given the transitivity of identity, if one person thinks of this object O and is therefore numerically identical with O, and S2 thinks O, then S1 and S2 will themselves be numerically identical. It is hard to appreciate how anyone could embrace this result. If Aristotle accepts strong isomorphism, then he commits himself to the absurdity that distinct minds are numerically identical. And he says, that would be very strange, right? If I'm thinking a thought and you're thinking a thought, and my mind and the thought are the same, and your mind is the same as that object, but we're thinking the same object, then your mind and my mind have to be the same mind. And that's ridiculous. So even though he seems to say that this unity happens at stage 2, Aristotle can't really mean it unless he thinks that everybody has one mind. But if you take my suggestion that nous is not a faculty, what there is not one single mind, which would be absurd. What there is one single understanding. What does one single understanding mean? Well, when you contemplate the Pythagorean theorem, and I contemplate the Pythagorean theorem, there's no sense in which, as it were, the understanding I have of the Pythagorean theorem is mine and mine alone. It's exactly the same as the understanding you have, assuming we're both right. Neither of us are wrong. We both understand it. We really, truly understand it. Then our understanding is the same. Now, how I got there is a story about me. My memories, my perceptions, where I learned it, what teacher, what book. That's individual to me. But the understanding that I achieve is going to be the same as the understanding that you achieve. That's what it is for it to be genuinely true and genuinely understanding. What's the upshot of this? Last point now. I'm going to try to make this a little clearer by drawing an analogy with Plato, hoping you might know this famous dialogue by Plato called the Phaedo. If you don't, I hope it is a little clear anyway. If you remember the Phaedo, Socrates is almost ready to die. Plato thinks that the soul and body are very distinct. He thinks the soul is what's doing the thinking. If you know a little bit about Plato, Socrates is looking forward after death, when his soul is separated from the body, which is very different than Aristotle's view, that the soul is going to finally know the forms. The forms are the perfect Platonic forms. So the soul will finally get the understanding that as a philosopher, Socrates has been seeking his whole life. That's why Socrates says he's looking forward to death. Now, if you think for a moment, if we think for a minute about what that post-mortem life is like in Plato's Phaedo, you'd have a disembodied soul, a mind, in cognitive contact with the forms. So there'd be Socrates' disembodied mind, and Socrates would be thinking, say, of form number 1. And then my disembodied mind would be thinking of form number 2, or form number 1. Well, if I'm contemplating the same form as Socrates in our posthumous existence, right, then what we have is there's going to be no difference between our minds. Because we're not going to have memories anymore, we're not going to have perceptions, all that went away with the body. All we are is a theoretical intellect. And so our intellects are going to look the same. They'll be numerically distinct, but that's the only thing that will separate them. Because as we contemplate the forms, the contemplation will be identical in those two cases. Aristotle takes this point a step further. On the Platonic picture, you still have a mind and an object. On Aristotle's picture, you no longer have the mind. There's just understanding. And so the upshot for this is that for Aristotle, understanding of essences are sort of there. There's understanding in the world to be had. And we, individual human beings, can participate in it. If we study and participate, we can participate in the understanding that is already there. Okay, on that strange note, I thank you very much for your patience and for listening. Thanks. Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. Great.
Va a haber un break de 5 minutos. Va a haber un break de 5 minutos.
What are the consequences of your account for Aristotelian self-understanding, self-consciousness? What would be what is self-consciousness or self-understanding for Aristotle?
Hold on, sorry. Okay. Thank you. That's a good question. Self-consciousness for Aristotle is not, in my view, not connected with nous. Aristotle thinks of self-consciousness as partially a perceptual ability, an awareness that arises with perception. There's, needless to say, a bit more to the story about perception than I was able to talk about today. But one part that I wasn't able to talk about is Aristotle thinks that in addition to the 5 what he calls special senses, hearing, smell, seeing, and so on, the 5 regular senses, the senses also have the capacity to work together. He doesn't think of this as a 6th sense. He calls it the common sense, or the senses working in common. When the senses work in common, they can perceive things that are perceptible by more than one sense. So, for example, motion. You can feel something moving, you can see something moving, right? Not necessarily by all 5 senses, but you can certainly by more than one. He also thinks, and the place to look if you're interested in this in part is De Anima, Book 3, Chapter 2, is where he talks about this. He also thinks that probably that common sense is responsible for our being aware of the fact that we are perceiving. So our perceiving that we perceive happens there. So it's not a matter of nous, because I think he thinks that animals too have self-awareness, an awareness of their own situation. It's part and parcel of what happens with perception. Now, the last thing I'll just say, something special that we tend to think about in more modern philosophy, I mean modern philosophy even from Descartes kind of on, as self-knowledge being some kind of special knowledge of the I, or something, the I, the letter, not the eye, the eyeball, given this talk. That's a problem that it's questionable whether he's worried about it at all, or whether he ever discusses that.
¿Otra pregunta?
Okay, if I understand you, you said that the nous is always in the stage 3.
Not always in the stage 3, no.
Not always.
No.
The nous is not always thinking the forms, the senses.
No, the nous.
Because I
Go
understand
ahead. Yes.
that, and this is very contrary to
Yes. The view of nous that I was defending is very counterintuitive. That's right. The identical, I mean, I think Aristotle's view is strange on this. Interesting, but strange. There is no nous at all at stage 1. Right. In particular, I mean, nous has no organ, so it's not anything physical, right? And there's no understanding there. The upshot of what I'm saying is the way we should think of nous is as the object, as the understanding that the human being possesses. So at stage 1, there is something that's potentially understanding. That's the human being. Just like you're potentially understanding of Greek. That subject is you. It's not your nous. We tend to think of it as, well, it's my mind. My mind is sitting there. No, it's you as an organism, right? With your perception, all your abilities to study and learn and so on. Then at stage 2, that's where, because of that passage where he says the identity happens between nous and the object right at stage 2, not at stage 3, like it does in perception. Because of that, that's what's leading me to argue that he's not thinking of nous as a faculty. Because of the identity at stage 2. And that's when you actually have knowledge. The human being actually has understanding. To go to stage 3 nous, that's when I'm thinking about it. Right? So right now, let's say I have understanding of the Pythagorean theorem, but I'm not using that understanding. If I sit here and work on the Pythagorean theorem, then I'm stage 3 nous. But the nous and that understanding are identical already from stage 2. So it's different from my eyes, right? If I'm not smelling anything now, right, my nose is still there. It's still able to smell. And then I can take something and smell it. then it would go to stage 3. And then it would be united with, with its object of perception. And that's the disanalogy. Thank you.
Welcome. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I learned a great deal. I'm curious if you can expand a little bit on what you're saying at the beginning of your talk about through language one can achieve the third stage. So through the practice of speaking Greek with people who understand Greek, you are essentially at that fully actualized stage of being a Greek speaker. How does that relate to understanding? In other words, how does discourse for Aristotle relate to understanding? I'm just hear about the philosophy or the use of dialect or reasoning. How does one use language to get to understanding? More important, how does it change between the time of the ancient writers of philosophical texts and the writers of philosophical texts today, after Montaigne invents the essay and a very different, more personal approach?
That's not a small question. That's a big question. But I'll do my best to talk a little bit about it. Aristotle thinks that how we acquire knowledge is via our experiential route. Okay. Now the way this is, I mean, your question is not, as you say, expand a bit. It wasn't quite what I covered in the talk, so this is something on the side here, or something different. But it's related, certainly. Theoretical nous, and I mentioned this very quickly near the end, theoretical nous understands essences. Aristotle thinks of these essences as first principles. Okay, what he calls archai, or first principles. And now, since people were nice enough to get me this board, that may not look like it explains very much. So the point is in our search for knowledge of essences, and you could think of this as a scientific investigation, we go around the world, we use beliefs we have, we use things that are obvious to perception, we use dialectic, we use language, we argue, we discuss back and forth. We are working our way on the left side up towards the first principles. At the end of our investigation, we'll understand the essence of a rabbit. We'll have rabbit DNA. We're still working on the essence of rabbit that way. I mean, you might think we're getting close to that, or we're understanding the essence of gold or something. So that's working your way towards first principles. And he thinks there are many ways that we can acquire first principles for different branches of science and different branches of knowledge. And on those routes, discourse and dialectic are essential on that. Once you've got the first principles on the right-hand side, he says, then you're able to, there's a lot of argument about this, but then you're able to do what Aristotle seems to think of as formal demonstrative science. Once you've got the first principles, you can then deduce the rest. So the order of discovery, the left-hand side, working your way towards first principles, is different than the order of understanding once you've got the first principles. Right, so when you approach rabbits, you start with, well, they're furry things, they've got 2 legs, 4 legs, they're sort of like a hedgehog, but they're different, and you start to separate it out by just crude measures, and then we work on that, and we study the rabbit more, and we work our way up to the first principle. Once you've got the first principles, though, we'll be able to explain the features of the rabbit, the ears and the rest, from those first principles. And so dialectic is used on the way up towards those first principles.
Is that similar to what happens to the philosopher in Plato's analogy of the cave?
Yes, it is. I mean, Aristotle says at a couple points, he says, we should pay attention to what Plato says about whether we're working towards the first principles or whether we're coming down from them. He says that in the Nicomachean Ethics and other places. And that's similar to what Aristotle, to what Plato is doing.
I wanted to know more about the analogy between perception and thought. And so say that you wanted to say something about how is it that a particular person thinks essence. And so according to this view, you have to resort to form and to the matter. And in the case of thought, according to this view, you don't have to resort to matter. You can explain thought without appealing at all to how the brain works. And I wanted to know more about the notion of cause. Is it something that so with the notion of cause, you're trying to grasp what is it that characterizes, or what is the nature of I don't know. It seems that you're trying to grasp the nature of these living creatures, isn't it? And you're so you resort to form and matter to explain perception and thought. But in the case of thought, you don't resort to matter because you're not interested in saying how the brain works. And I was thinking that you could do the same with perception. So the two questions are, can you say more about the notion of cause in this view? And also, if we could just say, well, actually perception is more like thought, because you don't have to appeal to the organ. Actually, the function of perception is, of visual perception is to know more about shapes and color. I don't know if I'm being clear.
There seem to be a couple of different concerns there. I'll try to sort them out a little bit. One concern has to do, I think, with the role of matter, right? And the fact that, as you put it, Aristotle wasn't interested in studying the brain or knowing how the brain works. I tried to suggest it's not that he wasn't interested in the brain or how the brain works. It's that he had a theoretical reason, a justification, for thinking that the mind couldn't be in a bodily organ. And that theoretical reason was because if the mind was materially constructed, it would constrain what could possibly be thought, just like the sense organs constrain what could possibly be thought. He also has an additional argument that I didn't mention, which is, he says, if you perceive something that's too intense, right, hearing a sound that's too loud, it can make you deaf. It can break the sense organ somehow, which suggests strongly that he does think there's, of course, some ordinary causal relationship, right? Or if you're in very, very bright light, you'll be blind for a minute. You'll be temporarily blind. He says that's not the case for nous. When you're thinking something especially clear, unbelievably intelligible, right? Like, truths of geometry or something like that. The mind thinks them more clearly, not less clearly, and it isn't destroyed. So he's trying to account for the plasticity of the mind. Now, it is interesting, the little bit that we do understand about the brain, needless to say, the brain is no ordinary organ, right? It wires and rewires. It has the plasticity that Aristotle wants it to have. It's not constrained by its materiality in the way that our eyes are constrained. And so, he hadn't envisioned, of course, a brain that could whatever the right metaphor or the latest metaphor would be, wires and rewires itself. But so that's the explanation of that lack of organ. Then you also had a question about cause. I wasn't as clear about what that question was. I mean, part of it was, you said that if he wants to give an account of living organisms, right, according to the four causes, then he's going to also cite the material cause, right? Now, and the very beginning of what you said, if I'm remembering, is when you started to talk about what was the explanation of individuals, right? Individuals achieving this sort of understanding. Well, there will be a material cause of that, because the subject, as I tried to suggest, is the human being, is the embodied human being, right? So it's you, the individual, who comes to have this understanding. And so there is a material cause to that understanding in a sense. It's not the brain, it's you. It's the human organism, right? And you have both form and matter. And so that's the causal structure of that.
Two questions. The first is concerning the idea that understanding is a kind of scientific understanding. My doubt is about what happened with the common sense. We could say that the common sense is not understanding. The second is a question that we make us with all of the swallows, but that is when you talk about this understanding, objective understanding, perhaps we think about the mathematics immediately, but we could say that the same with respect to all cognoscible things.
Okay. So the two questions are related. It seems to me, fairly closely related. Again, this is a good question, as with the others. I mean, touching on things that I didn't have time to discuss fully here. Understanding, there's more, I meant by understanding something more technical than one would ordinarily say. So there's ordinary knowledge. Okay, let's just call that ordinary knowledge, ordinary awareness that there are people in this room, that I have two hands, and all those kinds of things. None of that is understanding, which for Aristotle is the word episteme, where we get epistemology. And since, apropos of the other question I got about first principles, Aristotle thinks that the most formal and rigorous type of knowledge, episteme, which some people translate scientific understanding, because it's more than just knowing, right? When you know something, you might just know that something is the case without, we would say, understanding why it's the case. When you have scientific understanding, you have a full understanding of why the thing is the way it is. Understanding is going to result once you do the demonstration from the first principles. The conclusion of that demonstration down the right-hand side of that little silly sketch, down the right, the conclusion is something you have knowledge of. And you understand it because you know the premises that have preceded it. So that's what I mean by scientific understanding, and that's what nous is. Now, nous is guaranteed to be correct in the narrow sense, because just like knowledge is guaranteed to be correct, meaning if you have knowledge, it has to be right. If you're wrong, then you thought you had knowledge, but you don't really. The same is true for nous, for understanding, right? So you would not really have nous. You might think you have nous, but if your understanding is incorrect in some way, if it's false, then you don't have that understanding after all. So the achievement that is theoretical nous is quite different from common sense, or common sense understanding. Now, for those of you who know a little more about Aristotle, it's not true that Aristotle always uses the word nous and the associated verb noein in this strict and narrow sense. He uses it also in the way that you were suggesting for ordinary thinking and ordinary thought. He even uses it that way a little bit, especially the verb noein, in the De Anima. But, and I didn't present the whole argument for that here, and I can't go through all the textual evidence, I'll just cut to the conclusion. In 3.4, I'm arguing, and I believe, that he's discussing nous in that narrow sense, in that theoretical narrow sense. Last point, and this has been somewhat covered, related to your second question, the idea of understanding being objective, right? Since it's the truth that follows from this, it's got the relevant kind of objectivity. So what's subjective, as I said in the talk, would be our own individual experiential route to having learned that, which is empirical and use our senses and use dialectic and use all. But then once we have that understanding, insofar as it's true and genuine understanding, is going to be the same for all of us and objective. Thank you.
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, how does Aristotle deal with hallucinations and illusions, given that perception has to come from the outside? And the second one is concerning suffering or pain, and more precisely, if there's something like suffering of the nous, or how would we deal with what we may call emotional suffering or something of the like.
Okay, thank you. The hallucination and illusions issue, that comes up in the following context. Part of the larger perceptual apparatus that I also didn't discuss today. I just discussed the five senses. Aristotle thinks in ways that have confused people a bit, that the individual senses are always right about their objects. That is, sight is never wrong about color. Hearing is never wrong about sound. Now, of course, hearing is wrong about what the sound is, right? Oh, I think that's an animal. No, it's a car. I can't hear it. And of course, sight can be wrong about misidentifying something, misidentifying colors, misidentifying what something is. But the simple fact seems to be, if there's any hearing going on at all, there must be some sound. And if I'm seeing at all, I must be seeing some color or other, or else I'm just not seeing. So, despite the fact that he sort of claims a kind of incorrigibility with respect to the special sense and the objects, he of course considers what goes on with hallucinations and illusions. Hallucinations and illusions are a function of a somewhat more complicated part of the perceptual apparatus, which is different from the common sense, which I mentioned. By the time we're done, we'll have all the pieces on the table. In addition to the common sense is a capacity, in Greek, fantasia. And fantasia is what gets translated imagination sometimes, typically. That's a little misleading, because imagination is picturing something that's not present. Right? You imagine a beach or something like that to yourself. That's an exercise of fantasia. It's related to perception, because you have a fantasia of something that you've had perceptual contact with before in some way, and then you think about it that way. But it's also just appearance. So you can have a fantasia of when you engage your memory and you remember something. That's fantasia. If you think about some water that you'd like to drink, you can have a fantasia of pleasure and pain. Of the pleasure of, say, drinking water when you're thirsty. That too is an episode of fantasia. So he takes perceptual illusion to arise. For example, he uses the example of the sun looking like it's a foot long or something like that, or a boat moving, but it's not really moving. So those perceptual illusions simply arise as a result of the exercise of appearance and how it affects us. That's where that happens. And adjudicating between what are true and false appearances, that's a function of reason. right? We are able, in a way that's similar to a lot of later accounts, I mean Stoic accounts and even Cartesian accounts. We have an appearance that the sun is, you know, this big. Well, I don't know how big is it. It looks this big, but we don't need to assent or agree to that appearance. Our reason doesn't agree to it. Our non-rational eyes, I can't get rid of the appearance of the bent ore in the water or the sun being smaller, but I don't have to assent to that. And that's what happens for hallucinations and visual illusions. For suffering and pain, that's an interesting question. I would like to think some more about that. As far as I'm recalling off the top of my head, pleasure and pain are part of the perceptual apparatus. Okay, now I'm remembering, right? He says, as soon as we have perception of pleasure and pain, and so we have desire. So for Aristotle, he thinks that even like a worm has desire and experiences pleasure or pain because it goes towards some things and avoids others. So if you put a match near it and it retreats, that shows that not only is it perceiving warmth, it's perceiving it as painful, as to be avoided. Other things are perceived as to be pursued or as pleasurable. And this happens in all animals. It's what governs locomotion, and it becomes very important for human beings because depending on how we are habituated, how we're brought up to experience pleasure or pain, that determines what we go for and what we don't. And so if we've been badly brought up, we take pleasure in things that are bad for us and that we shouldn't do. And if we're well brought up, we are pained by those things and we take pleasure in things that we ought to. If we're well brought up, we like eating fruits and vegetables. When we're badly brought up, we like ice cream. And so that's a function of perception, training your perception to experience pleasure and pain as part of perceiving.
Iakovos, you said that, well, you are taking nous as thought or thinking. If I remember well, there are many translations for that term. Intellectual intuition, intelligence, understanding, etc. So, I would like to know first, why did you choose thinking or nous? Second, it seems to me that in the first part of your talk, you refer to nous as thinking, and then in your proposal you are using understanding rather than thinking. Well, first listen.
The reason that the title has thought, and the start of the talk was thinking, is because I was trying to talk about larger analogies between perception and thinking in general, which included what I've just lumped together here as talking about as ordinary thinking, right? Common sense thinking as in the other, you know, thinking about what to do next, thinking about what time it is, stuff like that. Then, in a way that, and you're right that nous, as I said, I think in answer to Alvaro, nous is used in that broader way also frequently. But it's my view too that he uses it in this narrower way, and that he's signaling actually throughout the De Anima, from the very beginning, from book 1, that nous is a special case. Nous in the narrow sense, where it means theoretical understanding, and so it means the understanding that's involved in grasping of first principles, as we learn in the posterior analytics and other places like that. And so that's why I have on the handout I have the somewhat artificial translation of intellect and intellecting. And then the funny thing, of course, that I end up trying to say is that nous should not be translated in those passages, in, for example, 3:4, as many people do translate it, as mind, or equivalently intellect, because I'm denying that it's a faculty. That's the strange part.
Just the last part, yes, one last question. Could you please tell us more about your proposal? Because I think it was very, very fast. I'd like to know more.
I'll just remind people, the upshot, and maybe this is an easy way to, or what I tried to make an easy way, but it was perhaps a little rushed at the end of the talk. I think that on Plato's view, which is a more intuitive view to us, you always have a distinction between the mind and the object of thought. So this is true for what is clearly a case for Plato of theoretical intellect, where theoretical intellect, the object of theoretical intellect, and the best kind of knowledge for Plato is going to be the forms. What knows the forms is for Plato, immaterial soul. So Plato has, at least in the Phaedo, seems to have something more akin to, a Judeo-Christian belief of some immaterial soul that inhabits the body. So it's a very dualistic picture of the kind that I tried to explain at the beginning of Aristotle's talk, that Aristotle rejects, and his form-matter account explains why he rejects that, or how he rejects it anyway. So that the picture that ends up being in place for Plato is that you have this disembodied immaterial mind that's then in contact with this object. What's odd about that, of course, is that there's not going to be any difference between our disembodied minds, those of us who are genuine philosophers and successfully separate our soul from our body at death and so on, and then we're there contemplating the form. There's going to be no difference because of partially the objectivity of the knowledge. The form of justice is what it is, objectively out there. And my mind contemplating it and your mind contemplating it, our minds are going to have exactly the same content. The only difference between our minds is going to be numerical. I mean, it would be impossible to, if that makes any sense, we'd be numerically different minds. Well, I think that Aristotle takes this whole idea a step further. And he gets rid of the idea that there's that separation of the mind and its object for theoretical intellect. Now, the part of the story that I didn't tell that is in the background of the rest of this is Aristotle's conception of God. God, that's in Metaphysics, Book 12, Chapters 7 and 9 is where you'd find that. For Aristotle, God is stage 3, permanent actuality, the highest activity of theoretical nous. Very obscure to think what he's saying, but it's nous thinking itself. So, on the view that I'm advocating for Aristotle, God has that active understanding. God is that active understanding. So the active understanding is there in the world. What some few human beings can do, if they work very hard, and they achieve that same theoretical understanding that God has of the way things actually are, then at that moment we participate in the same activity as God. One of the puzzles about a famous chapter that follows in the De Anima, 3.5, where Aristotle discusses this very weird thing called active nous. There's active nous and passive nous and how that connects. It's a whole conundrum. But one of the funny things is people think he's suddenly talking about God in the De Anima, which is supposed to be on natural philosophy. It shouldn't be about God. So why does God... But he doesn't say it's about God. He seems to say it's about people. But he's not clear, is it people or is it God? Well, if what I'm saying is right, that's part of the reason he's not clear. Because just like your understanding is going to be identical to my understanding, and when our understanding is at stage 3, we're actively understanding something there, that understanding is going to be no different than God's. We're going to participate in God's activity. And as long as we're participating, for the time that we're participating in it, there's no difference between God's thinking and our thinking. Now, God does that all the time, constantly. It's that, God doesn't do it all the time. God is the understanding, right? That's the tricky thing to get our heads around, right? It's not God doing some thinking. That's the Platonic idea. It's active understanding. There's our understanding there in the universe to be participated in by us. That's strange. I see that. It's kind of like weird, but I think that that's part of what Aristotle's gesturing to. Towards. Yeah. Okay.
Nuevamente agradecemos, thank you very much, y a todos ustedes por asistir.
Thank you all very much for the question.